your grace, dear fathers, sisters, and brothers. It's an honor for me to be here at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, a prestigious theological institution and a place offering safe space and for reflection and critical thinking. I'm also thankful to Father Nathanael for his initiative in organizing this timely colloquium, a topic on Orthodoxy and Humanitarianism, a topic that has not been internationally addressed, to my knowledge, in the last 10 years since the Valamo consultation in 2004. I'm also thankful for the invitation to me to contribute to this panel and share with you some thoughts that are related to my work and mission at the World Council of Churches. These ideas will reflect on some common concerns related to our Orthodox Christian and humanitarian responsibility in the world, and more particularly in the Middle East region, which is our focus during this panel. My short presentation is divided into three parts. The first one, I'll consider the Good Samaritan parable as one of the foundational approaches to Christian humanitarianism. The second one, I will try to draw some guidelines from that parable for our work in the humanitarian field. And the third part, I'll speak quickly on the implication on humanitarian action in the context of our region in the Middle East. For us Christians who are rooted in the soil of the Middle East since the dawn of Christianity, diaconia and humanitarianism are intrinsically linked to our presence and witness in the region. In this region, Christians come from diverse ethnic backgrounds, and we have been living throughout long centuries within broad religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity. In this context, and in relation to our theme, allow me to begin my presentation inspired by a biblical reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which will be the foundation of my approach to humanitarianism in the region. In this powerful parable, Jesus' intention was to interpret the passage of the scripture, which we commonly call the Golden Rule. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Apparently, for the expert in law who has put Jesus to test, the love of God was not the problem, at least from a hermeneutical point of view. He had a whole system of religious and ritual requirements that guided him. God is kept safe in a temple or a church or a mosque or a sacred place, and we worship and adore him to show him our devotion and fervor. Perhaps the embarrassment of our law expert with this commandment was that it makes a close connection between the love of God and the love of the neighbor, perhaps even placing it on an equal footing with the love of the neighbor, as it has been reminded to us this morning by Father Sabas. Therefore, we are not misinterpreting the text if we say that our love of God is measured according to the concrete acts of love we do to our neighbor. Do this and you will live. Love, at least from a biblical perspective, is an incarnational act that is practiced, not an abstract notion. In this commandment remains the question of the neighbor, of the other, which is embarrassing because it has to be defined and because it opens the door to many interpretations. Interpretation is done through an illustration of the daily life of his time, but also ours. The parable he told us remains one of the most cherished and commented upon, as it continues to challenge us on the meaning of the neighbor, as well as the power of love that needs to go beyond all ritual prescriptions, even dogmatic ones. Jesus encourages the lawyer to reflect for himself on the meaning of neighbor and the meaning of love, in telling us the story of a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers who stripped him, leaving him half dead. And you know the story, I'll skip it. Despite that, in our Orthodox tradition, very often the Good Samaritan represents Jesus and the wounded person, the first Adam, and the first Adam also can represent Jesus or the restored image of Jesus, it is still arguable that the center character of the story is that of the victim who fell to the bandits. It is the distance that separates us from the victim that determines the nature of the other characters. We are in a constant movement of rapprochement and estrangement vis-à-vis the victim. In this sense, we become the neighbor of the other through a concrete act of rapprochement or compassion, or as we usually express it in our ecumenical jargon, concrete solidarity actions. But it may well be ourselves who are this other in need of a neighbor who comes to us in our times of difficulty, distress, and tribulations. Some guiding principles out of this parable. In the framework of this colloquium, and as part of our ecumenical solidarity with the Christians in the Middle East, I find this parable that it speaks to us today more than ever in a very relevant way. In a region with a religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity, where community identities are so tense, where isolationism has become a sort of refuge, Jesus calls us and asks us again this embarrassing question: who is your neighbor? Who is the other for you? Is it the person or community with whom you feel comfortable? Or is it the person or community that suffers and needs your friendship, your support, your listening, your compassion, your solidarity, and your love? To be a true neighbor in the Middle East is not less than the mystery of being the different of a different. It requires us to see in the other who is the different, who is suffering, who is afraid, who is slandered, who is dehumanized, to see in this other an otherness that is in the image and likeness of God, who emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, an unjust death, a death on the cross. During one of the worship services in the World Council of Churches, a colleague of mine, Reverend Peniel Rajkumar from India, reflected on the same parable from a southern perspective and brought to our attention that besides the character of the unknown victim, also a southern perspective, there is also the unknown innkeeper who invested trust in the Samaritan where he had all reasons to cultivate suspicion and prejudice. He did not discriminate against him, but worked alongside him to restore the fullness of life and the dignity of the victim. With Blessed Augustine, we can well see the inn and the innkeeper representing the church, who is both a body and a space of healing and restoration, where even the outsiders can be agents of transformation and justice. In our region today, Christians have a very long practice of diaconia and humanitarian work. As it has been well expressed in the WCC last 10th Assembly in Busan, their mission and witness in society is evident in multiple spheres of public life, such as in culture, politics, education, health services, women and youth development, child protection, social services, relief and development. Christian spirituality and witness are revealed by the vibrant monastic communities and parishes, theological faculties, hospitals, schools, and humanitarian services. 2 weeks ago, and always during the worship service in our WCC chapel, but this time during the commemoration of the centenary of the Armenian genocide, we heard a deeply touching reflection by another colleague, Carla Hijoyan, sharing with us her own family's story of massacres, dispossession, and wandering. From the time of her great-grandfather to our generation, several wars took place in the region, and hell has never stopped striking. Christians in our region view themselves today as victims, but they are also perceived as such. Exodus, uprootedness, discrimination, suffering, persecution, disappearance, are the terms most used and associated with the Christians and other religious and ethnic minority groups. However, we should never forget that this is happening in the context where whole populations in countries such as Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and other countries are witnessing the atrocities of outrageous wars where millions have been and are still being killed, tortured, disappearing in jails, suffering lasting injuries, internally displaced, and forced to find refuge in neighboring countries. When we talk about the plight of Christians in the region, we are fully aware that it is part of the suffering of all peoples in that region. It is very important to affirm from the very beginning that our intent is not to single out those sufferings of Christians, because we know that, unfortunately, their plight is often exploited by some political parties in the region and throughout the wider world, as well as by certain religious groups to fuel Islamophobic tendencies and draw negative images of Islam. When we approach the vital question of the humanitarian role of Christians and their presence and witness in the Arab world, our intent is to reinforce a positive engagement of the churches in the life of the nations to which they belong, so that they see in the other the image of the suffering servant of God. In conclusion, I will draw 5 very quick implications in the context of our Middle East region for the humanitarian work. So the above mentioned main guiding principles for us, to see in every victim a suffering neighbor and to accept to be the church in receiving and healing the needy, would suggest that we consider and discuss the potential following implications relevant to the specific context of the Middle East. The first, I would call it reading the signs of the times. In the region, there are several conflicts and wars, very often interconnected. The disastrous situation is not due to a natural catastrophe. It's not an earthquake. Therefore, any humanitarian action that lacks and or misses a deep analysis of the context will be reduced to acts of charity that do not necessarily help to heal and cure the wounds. Interpreted into a Christian language, this sound analysis could be called reading the signs of the times. This is why a concerted common Christian reading or analysis is extremely helpful and necessary for an international humanitarian Christian endeavor. This reading is diametrically opposed to an essentialist reading of history that would see that the situation of Christians has always been dramatic in the region since the invasion of the Arab Muslims coming from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Even more dangerous than the essentialist reading of history would be an essentialist reading of Islam itself or of Muslims, where to say Islam has never changed and Muslims have always been the same and they have always behaved such in history, etc. Therefore, there are essential questions that could help us make a substantial reading of the signs of the times in the nowadays Middle East region, and that should be addressed courageously. The second one would, I'll call it the transformative humanitarianism. A Christian humanitarian action should aim at being transformative in its nature. This entails that churches in the region, as well as Christians and humanitarian actors, are not part of a system that manages and contains conflicts. We should rather be courageous to address their root causes. One example that comes quickly to my mind, due to my quite long experience dealing with it, is the conflict in Palestine-Israel. Palestine is a classic and sad example of non-transformative humanitarian action. We are put into a very difficult dilemma, in fact, that you know better than I do. Without humanitarian aid, millions of people will be affected and the Palestinian Authority will collapse. But at the same time, international aid, which includes important amounts spent through church-related aid agencies, is indirectly serving the maintaining of the matrix of occupation by dispensing Israel from being responsible for the population under its illegal occupation. We must regretfully acknowledge that as long as most of the conflicts in the entire region continue to be sustained through patronage and a refusal to hold those who routinely abuse human rights and international law to account, we can be sure that our humanitarian work, our humanitarian action, will not heal the wounds, and hell will continue to strike. Advocacy and humanitarianism. In order to be able to contribute to the transformation of our societies so that they reflect more the life in the kingdom of God, advocacy for justice and peace should be an integral part of our humanitarian endeavor. Our feeling of being a minority, often persecuted, should not prevent us, even I would say it should encourage us to see ourselves as the salt of the earth, the leaven that leavens the whole lump, the little candle that lights the whole house. Many parables and Bible teachings invite us to be the servants of peace and justice among men and women of our time. The ethical and moral challenges and imperatives. It is dramatic to notice that the state of decadence we have reached in the Arab world, where we will have to choose between different kinds of dictatorships and religious ones, two sides of the same coin. We should be able in the region, we deserve it, we should be able in the region and beyond to determine what are the ethical, I should stop. What are the ethical and moral imperatives that must guide us and steer our political judgment so that with courage and enough vision we are enabled to challenge systems of oppression and corruption in our societies. The last point in 30 seconds, holding up to hope in hopeless situations. This is the core of our Christian faith, and it should always encourage us when dealing with crises in our region. Keeping hope is also working for transformation. It is seeing signs of hope where others only see the empty part of the glass. At the risk of shocking many people, I personally continue to see the different movements in the Arab world as by far the most promising transformative ones that the Arab world has ever known in its modern history. This is despite the fact that the immediate result was the aggravation of existing problems, such as the radicalization of political and religious discourses, immigration and brain drain, identity crisis, withdrawal from the political scene, etc. The claim by young people for freedom, equality, social justice, and political participation are not yet buried. We hold up to hope and believe that they will surface or resurface soon, and that a new consciousness for equal citizenship will emerge. And thank you.